was incredibly honored and privileged to be intern at the American Academy of Diplomacy, and I was able to complete a project titled "Women in Diplomacy," um, moderated by Ambassador Ronald Neumann. It's incredibly challenging to introduce my very distinguished speakers, but I will do my best to introduce you to them. First, I'm incredibly honored and privileged to introduce you to Ambassador Bernadette Allen. Ambassador Allen served as the United States Ambassador to the Republic of Nigeria from March 2026 throughout January 2010. Other overseas postings include Consular General in Montreal, Canada, and Chief of Consular Service in the People's Republic of China. I'm incredibly privileged and honored to introduce you to another distinguished speaker, Ambassador Kathleen Doherty. Ambassador Kathleen Doherty served as the U.S. Ambassador to Cyprus from 2015 to 2019 and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Europe. She also served as a Dean of the Foreign Service Institute. Also, I'm incredibly privileged to introduce you to Ambassador Laura Kennedy. Ambassador Kennedy served as a U.S. Ambassador to Turkmenistan from 2001 to 2003. She also was a U.S. permanent representative to Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And lastly, I'm incredibly privileged to introduce you to the President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ambassador Ronald Neumann, formerly a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, served 3 times as ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan from July 2025 to April 2026. Before Afghanistan, Ambassador Neumann, a career member of Senior Foreign Service, served in Baghdad from February 2024.
Thank you, Jovana. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be with you today. By the way, that was 2004, not 24. I have not just come back from Baghdad. So I'm very lucky because I have 3 very distinguished and accomplished colleagues with us today. At my request, Jovana just gave you the highlights of their biographies. They've all had long careers in the Foreign Service. And before we go into that, I just want to say, I note that we have some colleagues and some former interns that are in the audience today, and welcome back to all of you. So we have an interesting subject today, which is this question of women in diplomacy, women and diplomacy. And this is an area that has changed a great deal over the last 30, 40 years, certainly since I came in the Foreign Service. But it is still an area that may need some change, may be evolving. And I think it's important to recognize, and for me to recognize as the only male on the panel today, that I have with me 3 colleagues who are all distinguished professionals and diplomats in their own right. They're not diplomats who are women or diplomatic women. They're diplomats who happen to be women, but they are all distinguished in their own right. And they are women is the subject of today's discussion, but not a function of their professionalism. So I wanted to ask each of my colleagues to say a few words to start off with about partially what you'd like somebody to carry away, what you'd like them to know about serving in diplomacy as a woman, whether it's challenges you faced as you came in or challenges that you feel are in front of us, or simply advice to how to go in this business. So Bernadette, Ambassador Allen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, and good afternoon or early evening, I guess, to everyone. And I want to make a correction. I was the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Niger, which is the Francophone country adjacent to Nigeria. So that happens sometimes. People will say Nigeria, but it's actually Republic of Niger. And the one thing I would like to say is when I started in the Foreign Service in 1980, my very first ambassador was a woman. So for me, I wasn't, I guess, introduced to the service thinking about man or female, male or female. I was there as a junior entry-level officer, and the ambassador was a woman. And so the job was, for me, as the first, I was the first general services officer, American general services officer at the post. And it was a post actually it was in Bujumbura, Burundi. And it was a GSO section that was 96% men. And I was a 23-year-old female GSO, first-time American in that position, previously filled by a third country national Pakistani. So I came in there with the energy of a young, almost like a Peace Corps mentality, ready to jump into things. And so because I got, I think, engaged directly with my staff, not thinking, well, I'm a woman dealing with a lot of men. It was like, we have a job to do. Let's get the job done. And I think that served me throughout my career. And, you know, at every level, I never thought of myself as well, I'm a female person going into this job because I had so many females ahead of me. As I said, female ambassador. And then as my career went on, as you know, we had 3 female secretaries of state during my tenure. So as far as the service, I could see more and more women in these roles. I had several female ambassadors that were mentors. So from my perspective, we all went in as ambassadors. And so it pretty much is in line with what Ambassador Neumann already stated at the beginning.
It's us well launched. I wish we had the locals on a program to get their perspective sometimes. I'm going to go ahead in alphabetical order. Kathleen, Ambassador Doherty, over to you.
Again, thanks for the invitation to speak today. In contrast to Bernadette, I didn't think I had a female boss at any level for the first 10 years of my career. And so all my role models in my beginning part of my career were following men. I had some peers who were women in it, but we were still very much a minority in any of the sections I served in. But as I got up into my career and about 2/3 into it, I started having more peers and more supervisors that were women. But I actually try to model myself on the best characters possible, whether they were female or male leaders and what traits I could copy to be there. But I do think there are more women now entering the Foreign Service percentage-wise, but there's still an underrepresented of women at the senior most ranks. But part of it is a time of being in the service. I mean, it could take 15 to 20 years to get to a position of a senior leadership position. And if you're just starting off now, but I do think there are some challenges that I look forward to to discussing with everyone about being a female leader, and also some huge advantages that you get with being a female leader.
Great. Laura, Ambassador Kennedy, over to you. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
Anyhow, thanks for including me. I think I'm clearly the oldster on the panel because I joined in 1975. And this was just after women started to really join the Foreign Service in any numbers because they had dropped the requirement to leave the service if you married, which is, of course, the most gross violation of civil rights, but it was taken for granted up until the 70s. So as you can imagine, there were not only no women bosses, almost no even women peers. It was compounded for me by my first overseas post being Moscow. And the old Soviet Union I literally never met nor ever even heard of a woman Soviet woman diplomat. So yeah, there were challenges, but as Kathleen, I think, said, I had some great role models and bosses, regardless of gender. But as I went up the ranks and started to tackle more issues that come with more seniority, how do you lead, how do you manage? I became very grateful for the women confidants and mentors that I was able to develop as I went along. So if we can get into this later, but again, advice, seek out those people who can give you advice, of course, of any stripe, but certainly, your gender is part of your identity. So certainly seek out those people who can talk about gender issues as part of the complex of issues you'll deal with as a diplomat.
As we go along, there are some questions that I think really, I'm going to try to move this around, but pertain to all of us. And one of them is, I think, for a woman who is thinking about joining the Foreign Service, becoming a diplomat. And I'd like to ask each one of you, what would you say to that person? What do you think there's some of these fears out there, I'll be discriminated against. There are places where it'll be much harder to serve culturally. I can speak to that in the Arab world, but I'd like to ask each one of you, maybe we'll go in reverse order and start with Laura, to just give us your thoughts. What is it you want a young woman entering diplomacy to care about, or to know about, or to not fear, or to look forward to?
Okay, well, one, just being a diplomat, you're serving your country. It's an incredibly exciting, fulfilling, and also sometimes pure fun career, but it certainly has its challenges. One thing I'd say is that not only have we gone through really a revolution in my own career in my lifetime in terms of the ability of women to serve and lead in diplomacy, and like you, Ron, I've served in a lot of places where women were not part of the government leadership, let alone being major figures in diplomacy. That said, you're still an American diplomat, so they're going to pay attention to whatever you say or whoever you are because you are the American representative. But also pay attention to, I'd say, and take inspiration and be part of global developments in terms of gender equality. I think back to Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady in Beijing. Women's rights are human rights are women's rights in 1995, huge galvanizing effect. Look at what's happening in the UN. Women's rights are part of the strategic development goals that were announced years ago at the UN. I've had a special field in arms control in, I think it was 2002. The UN Security Council passed 1325 that took special note of the role of women in conflict and resolution and conflict situations. I think it was in 2014, maybe, the Swedish Prime Minister announced the world's first feminist foreign policy. We've had a number of states who have embraced feminist foreign policies, ranging from Mexico to Germany. And so for one who specifically worked in multilateral diplomacy as well as bilateral diplomacy, it's a really interesting time seeing how gender issues are evolving around the world. So it's something you could be part of as an American diplomat, and also affecting change in gender equality around the world.
Kathleen?
I think Laura did a great job of kind of pointing out that all the credible things are happening on a very large scale. I think one of the advantages of being a female diplomat, and Laura said it first, as an American diplomat and as American ambassador, whether people like the United States or not, we have more access to the centers of power than most other countries because we are the 800-pound presence in any one country. So by being an American diplomat, an American ambassador, you have access. But then being a female American ambassador, you have access to groups that normally would not get the attention or have not traditionally gotten attention. So in two of the countries of which I served in, where women were critical to peacekeeping discussions and peace negotiations, their voices traditionally were not heard or respected, not even respected, they just weren't heard. But I was able to use my position as a female ambassador to reach out to groups. And I immediately had some credibility just as being a female with them. And I had a seat at their table, they had a seat at my table. And I think that really enhanced my ability to influence different developments in a country. So I was able to use my gender as yet an added tool in my diplomatic toolkit to be able to get some progress. And just anecdotally, as Laura mentioned, being an ambassador or being a diplomat can just be a lot of fun. And I actually say I had a reputation of being the dancing ambassador, and I would just dance at a lot of parties. And I have a hard time imagining a male ambassador having the same freedom to get up and dance, and use that as a kind of equalizing tool, because I'm not a good dancer, by the way, so that so that I was able to allow people just to have fun. So using your gender, I think it can be a real advantage in the right time and place.
I would certainly underscore that advantage in the Arab world. I know many people have thought, oh my God, women can't serve in the Arab world. We've now had many distinguished colleagues who have been in the Arab world. But one thing that's very clear, well, two things. One is they are the representative of the United States. They have the power. Or if you're the consul, you've got the visa. So they're going to be dealt with. And the other is that they get in to see the wives of senior Arab officials in a way that none of us men have access to. And often these people, the wives, are very powerful people in their own right. They have a great deal of influence. And they also know a heck of a lot. So having access to that other half of society can be a huge advantage. Bernadette, you might want to speak particularly to, what about a young Black woman who's thinking about this career? Do you encourage her? What should she also watch out for? What would you caution her? What would you encourage her?
I would certainly encourage anyone that had an interest in foreign policy to do so. Like it was a privilege, as everyone says, to serve the country. And I wanted to actually piggyback on something that Kathleen said about exposure to other organizations. For example, I met with so many NGOs that dealt with women's issues when I was in Niger, which is a developing country. And of course, literacy for women was such a major problem. One of the areas that we wanted to encourage. And so working with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, USAID, and the military, we were able to do a lot of programs to promote women's education. Also, being that it was a Muslim country, again, women had a different type of place. And so one of the first things I did after I presented my credentials is I wanted to meet with both of the president's wives, because he had two. So I said, I want to make sure I meet with them both on the same day. I don't want to, stick one day with one and then wait another week. I said I need to meet with both each day. So I started with wife number one and wife number two and talked about their various interests. But also the one advantage was women actually had several senior roles in the Nigerian government. The foreign minister happened to be a woman. And so was a couple of the other ministers. But the fact was they were getting used to seeing more women in leadership positions. So having a female foreign minister, my predecessor was a female. So they weren't so shocked about that in Niger. But the one thing that was, I would say, one of the best things that I remember from my tenure there was my visibility around the country made more young ladies interested and their parents interested in seeing that they were getting education. My moniker was, they called me Ambassador 4x4 because I used to do a lot of cross-country travel. I did several trips going. Usually when I went out, I would go out maybe two to 3 weeks at a time, going from one corner to another to 9 different major cities. And mainly, I always insisted I had to meet with women's groups, as well as some of the chiefs, the tribal chiefs, which were very important. So everything that most men would do, I would do, but I would add a lot of more women's activities and issues. And we built a lot of schools. I felt very good about the improvement of girls' attendance. One of the things that we wanted to know was, why is it that the girls cannot go to school in some of these communities and villages? And the one issue was water, because the girls had to go out and collect water. And so someone at USAID said, well, let's do a survey. And the next thing you knew is, well, why don't we just say, if we're going to help build schools and use our Peace Corps folks out there, let's also build a well at each school. And that was the difference for a lot of young girls that were able to go to school, because we said at the end of the day, they can bring the water from the well and take it home. And the number of girls that were able to attend school increased during that 4-year period. And I hope it's, continue. I know there've been some setbacks, but certainly I think the visibility aspect was very important, being seen. And so every time I'd visit around the country and being on television, some girls, I remember one parent, and he was a man, that came and said, my daughter runs to the television when she sees you and says, what can I do to be like, her? And he'd say, well, you have to go to school. And so I felt a lot of young girls were actually seeing me out there, and a lot of the women, I mean, everywhere I went, I hadn't intended it to be that way, but I think I'm very curious about local communities and what's going on. So I loved traveling, even though it was difficult travel. I'm not going to say it was easy. And as I said, we traveled in a 4x4, and in a lot of places, the one thing that was interesting for me as a woman is most of the time I had a lot of men traveling with me, and I always usually maybe had 1 or 2 females, but there were no places like rest stops like we have here. And so the men had to take a lot of bio breaks. They'd say, Madam Ambassador, may we stop for bio breaks, but there was no place for the women. And so I always said we had a much stronger constitution, and were much better planners, and also very open to, I would say at a lot of the different meetings, women were heard more, I think, as with having a female ambassador. Sometimes women have said, and even here we do in the States, say that women sometimes aren't heard the way they should be. But I always had a good ear for both men and women. I listened to everyone. I think most female ambassadors are more open to listening to all the voices around the table. And so being an African-American at the time, and I don't want to take up all the time, but I want to say it was during the period when there was the primary election with soon to be President Obama, but it was Clinton and Obama. And everybody would stop and say, is it possible in the United States of America that a woman or an African-American can become president? And I'd say, well, they're running, they're one of the major parties. Sure, one of them can be the future president of the United States. So I would get a lot of questions about African-Americans as well as the women rolling. Is it possible that, because they were saying there's never been anyone but a white male that was president. So they couldn't believe that one party would actually propose a woman or an African-American as a candidate.
Great moment. I'm going to go through one more question for each one of you, not for all three, and then we'll go to audience questions. But Kathleen, could be anyone, but I'm going to ask it to you. The Department of State certainly is a big advocate for women's role in the world, not just in the Foreign Service, but it's part of our major human rights approach. And how, as you served in countries where you've had to deal with this, does being a woman make people more or less responsive? Does it change how you put forward the issue?
Well, not dependent on the issue, but I do. I often tell this story. I was ambassador to Cyprus, and fairly recently, and before I went to Cyprus, there was a small newspaper that said the U.S. must not care about Cyprus because they're sending a female ambassador there. And so that I decided that they had no idea what they were talking about, clearly, because they were. I'm a feisty individual to begin with, but I was going to make sure that that individual and that journalist in that newspaper was going to be realize that they were completely wrong. That not just being a female ambassador was I was the first to the country that I served in. The first U.S. ambassador was female, and all my successors actually have been female as well since then. But I do think it's I do think sometimes you have added responsibilities. I do think initially my counterparts in other countries we're more used to seeing men in the room, and I often have the issue of being short, and so when I'd walk in with a bunch of men, people didn't know who the ambassador was, they would assume that one of the taller men were the ambassador and not the shorter female, and sometimes my male colleagues wouldn't pretend they were ambassador, but they like that initial recognition of being far more important. So I do think, women have the particular challenge of sometimes being a little bit more soft-spoken, though I'm not, but definitely being shorter often is the case. Male officers who are short also have that same challenge. But I do think, when you first walk into a room and many of your foreign counterparts, are the first time they meet you, they probably don't have as high expectation of you as they do as a male counterpart. They probably think you're going to be weaker, more easily to be influenced by them, maybe more easy to be manipulated by them, which of course is not the case at all. But I sometimes feel that that's the first presumption on their part.
Laura, you've had the longest career of our group, except for me, of course. I'm really the old fellow on the stage. Sort of a two-part question. What do you think has changed most in the role of women in the State Department since you entered? What do you see as the biggest challenge going forward?
Well, I guess, as I say, I'm so conscious of the huge strides that have been made. Now, again, we're talking about 40 years, so people, that may seem like an awfully long time, but going from, virtually none to roughly 40%, and filling all the roles from top to bottom is pretty extraordinary. And I think in general that the State Department has given, it gets a lot of criticism. My experience has been that I've gotten a fair shake as a woman, and I'm grateful for that. I think a lot of the challenges, and they make it more severe, is if we see a devaluation of foreign service in general, because you can't succeed as a woman in the foreign service if your service as a diplomat isn't valued. And I worry about periods in the past where not only the percentage of women fell after these, decades of progress, but in general, I periods when I've seen the foreign service devalued. That's what I worry about most of all, because our service needs to be valued, whether you're a woman or a man or what have you. There's issues, I think, of certainly an aging population. Diplomats have to worry about, kids plus parents. I think the challenge is to continue to make it easier for people to deal with family issues, and have it defined as a family issue, not as a woman's issue. Although traditionally, I think we know that those responsibilities have fallen more heavily on women. We need to constantly, I think, encourage women to take leading roles. Sometimes women will not push themselves as hard as they might, especially in leadership roles, because, again, you're conscious of multiple responsibilities. There's this phenomenon known as the imposter syndrome, where you think somehow that, you're just lucky to be there rather than entitled to be there. So you have to fight against all these things. But again, look for those role models, those great achieving women. In my career, Beth Jones, Rose Gadamuller are two of the main ones I'd pick out. You know, when you ask Bernadette about special challenges of being a woman in Black, I think about my colleague and friend Bonnie Jenkins, who's now our Undersecretary for Arms Control. She started a group for women of color advancing peace and security, WCAPS. Because my area, one of my specialties I mentioned is arms control, where women in particularly have been in the past very underrepresented, let alone Black women. This has been an enormous success in terms of encouraging women to think about arms control and security studies. And I hope we all support organizations that encourage women to be active in this field. I think, Kathleen, is it Women in Foreign Policy? I think you're on the board of. I was a sort of a founding council member for the Leadership Council of Women in National Security. There's lots of groups, for example, supporting women in arms control and nuclear issues. I think about Ambassador Pam Hamamoto during the Obama years, when she was ambassador at Geneva, which is actually a bigger UN city than even New York in terms of the numbers of people. They started a group called International Gender Champions, again, to encourage all countries to support and increase the number of women in diplomacy. One of my friends, Laura Holgate, now our ambassador in Vienna, started a subset of that, of International Gender Champions in Nuclear. So there's lots I think we can continue to do to encourage all Americans to think about foreign service, and in particular, women. I mean, because there may be some specific issues about, you know, well, you're still somewhat of a minority. What's you know, family life going to be like, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing I also want to put in a plug for, we need to really honor the people who not only were you know, diplomats, but worked for specifically to advance women in the American Foreign Service. And I think about Allison Palmer, whom I never met, made, I think, a lot of enemies, but spent about 30 years suing the State Department on class action suits for women. You know, that was a pretty tough thing to do. She didn't make a lot of friends, as I said. After some 26 years in the Foreign Service, she left as an 03. But a lot of women today have her and others like her to thank for where we've gotten today. So as I say, here's to you, Allison Palmer.
And Bernadette, I don't want people to think we're just sugarcoating this. I mean, you've all made the point that this is an exciting career, that it's an honor to serve the country and represent the country. And you've all had very successful careers. But lest people think that we're just sugarcoating the issue, what do you think the greatest challenge is right now for women in the Foreign Service?
I would say it may be dealing again with some of the balances of family life. I mean, it didn't affect me because, well, I was a single officer, still am a single person. So it didn't affect me as far as selection of assignments and so forth. But I do remember colleagues that would have to balance what their spouse, whether the spouse wanted to serve abroad or would have not any opportunities to work abroad if they served in some of these, especially some of the developing countries. But also the children, you know, school life, those types of things. So those are things that are very, I think, more difficult when you have the women officers. Of course, you had the tandem couples that would work those things out. But I remember a lot of times it was, if you had women and the spouses couldn't adjust, the women would have to decide, is it going to, if they were going to stick with the Foreign Service career or, you know, take a leave of absence, those types of things. So that's very challenging for women. I would say that I think I've been fortunate. I've served in a lot of, except for Montreal, Canada, I've served in very remote places. So it can be isolating, especially for a single. So I want to speak, I guess, from a single person's point of view. Served in Guangzhou, China as an African American, and I was, of course, very visible to the locals there. Everybody knew who I was because they didn't have a lot of Chinese or Mandarin speaking African Americans that they had been exposed to before. So I remember times when I would travel around my district, which covered like 4 provinces, and people would know me from, you know, outside of the capital and say, there she is. I could hear them saying it in Chinese. That's the one, and so forth. So you have to get used to that type of thing. And I have a lot of funny stories from China. One time checking into a hotel because I was visiting that consular district, and I started speaking in Chinese or in Mandarin, and the person at the desk kept looking at me confused. And so her colleague, she asked her colleague, well, what do I say? And she said, well, she's speaking to you in Chinese, stupid. And because she had tuned out that I could actually speak Chinese. And so, I mean, just getting used to those kind of things, you have to be open, you know, and know that people are curious. Don't be intimidated by those types of situations. But Philippines, Burundi, a lot of times for African Americans, it can be somewhat isolating. I mean, probably less so, I think, now, because back at that time, we didn't have FaceTime or, you know, the type of communication that is you have now back then. Back then, I remember in Burundi, it would take me about 6 to 8 weeks just to get a letter. And because we were at the end of the supply line. Now, at least you can contact your family and so forth. So it's less isolating, even if you're not physically with them. You can do like we're doing, Zoom in and catch up on what's going on. So that can be a challenge for some people. And, you know, we're all talking about mental health issues. You know, what kind of resources are out there for people when they do feel isolated, that type of thing. So that's something to bear in mind. And there may be fewer female colleagues that a woman has available to speak to or to communicate with than maybe the males have at a various posts, depending on, you know, where you're assigned.
Thank you. That's a wonderful story from China. It's funny because in a biography of General Stilwell, I read an almost identical kind of story that he was out in the countryside and addressed a couple of farmers asking for directions, and they just kept looking at him blankly. And finally, as he turned away, he heard one say to the other, I could have sworn he was speaking Chinese. And so there's obviously a cultural issue here. Jovana, you put this panel together, so you get the first question.
What was your driven inspiration to pursue a career in diplomacy?
I think that goes to everybody.
Yes.
Kathleen, you.
I was going to start out just because I didn't pursue a career in diplomacy. I was actually a double major, French language and linguistics, with intent to teach English as a second language. And I did that for 1 year in Marseille, France, where I met people in the Foreign Service. And at that time, Jimmy Carter was president, and I was told, oh, we need more women and minorities in the Foreign Service. We need people like you. Take the Foreign Service exam. And I was like, well, what is it? And at any rate, I spent that year talking to people who were in the Foreign Service, and I went and took the exam. And then eventually, you know, as I said, I changed career, but I did not go to, let's say, attend university with the intent of joining the Foreign Service. It wasn't even on my radar.
The same with me. I had no intention of joining the Foreign Service. I was actually looking to do international business, which I ended up doing a lot as a diplomat in terms of commercial and economic diplomacy. But I was in graduate school during the fall of the Berlin Wall and fall of the Soviet Union, and I ended up going to Berlin a few days after the wall opened up, and I had taken the Foreign Service test on a lark the year before, and combination of seeing how change was happening I was also facing unemployment at the graduate school, and when the State Department offered me a job, I was very excited that it was going to be steady employment. So it was not something that I came in and expecting to do as many years as I did. And again, very grateful that I fell into a career that I loved.
Yeah, I was going to say, neither did I plan on a foreign service career. I was actually focused on Southeast Asia, was my major in college. And these were the Vietnam War years. So I spent my college years demonstrating against the war. Would not have, at that point, so as an undergraduate, wouldn't have thought of working for the government that I was protesting against. But by the time I joined, the war was winding down, although it actually took me many years before I ever got to Southeast Asia. And I had studied Indonesian in graduate school. But I'd also say that just our theme of women in diplomacy, I graduated from Vassar College, which I'm proud to say was the first women's college in the United States. I was the last all-female class. It's now co-ed. So basically, sort of feminism was bred in us. I mean, before I even went to college. And so when we talk about being the first woman, no women, and so on, but I think that education from my all-female class at college stood me in very good stead. I also mentioned, just personally, I grew up as in a Navy family, so we moved constantly, and I suppose that helped predispose me to a career in the Foreign Service, because you're constantly having to navigate, new homes, even cultures within the United States. Anyhow.
Jovana, what have we got in the chat?
So I encourage our participants and audience to raise your hand or to put a question in a chat. So this is incredible opportunity to ask our panelists.
Yeah, well, I see one up there from iPhone of Janina.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you guys so much for hosting this. I'm a 2024 Pickering Fellow, so I know that I'm going to be entering in the Foreign Service in 2 years. And I was wondering if you had any advice about entering as a new Foreign Service officer or as part of the FSOA or A100's early level stuff. Do you have any advice for a future female diplomat?
Over to you guys.
I'd be happy to start off on that. I mean, I was the dean of the Foreign Service Institute that covers the entry-level class, and I would meet with a lot of the women. You'll find in your entry-level class, you'll have 22-year-olds and 55-year-olds up to that, and everyone has a story. Everyone joined the Foreign Service because they wanted to be public servants. Get to know your classmates. They will be your friends for the entire duration of your career. Those that you sit next to, those who you stand. I laughed that in my A100 class, we were in alphabetical order for the first few weeks, and all four of us in the first row all became ambassadors. Now, I think it was just a coincidence, but we all ended up supporting each other as you go up the ranks. So it is these are your band, these are your support group, and there are no dumb questions in the Foreign Service. So remember that when they're in the first few days, when they're giving you so much information, don't think that everyone around you knows the answer, because they don't. They just are afraid to ask.
Who else would like to weigh in on advice? It's your chance to shape the next generation here.
I just say, again, picking up on that, and maybe some of the things I said before, just network is, I mean, that's sort of I guess a hackneyed verb, but meet as many people as you can, men and women. Get advice for them, ask for them. And also remember, when you seek out people as mentors, especially if they're an older generation like me, it's actually, it's not a burden for the mentor, because you are mentoring them. you're keeping the older people in touch with the younger generations. You know, what are college students thinking about today? And as I mentioned before, some of the women role models were just crucial in my career. So, and when you join your A100 class, you'll get a class mentor. And the State Department, over the years, I've also seen place a greater and greater role on mentoring. But aside from those official mentors that are sort of assigned or available through C channels, just look around. As Kathleen said, your peers and your entering class. You know, you're still, I guess, in graduate school as a Pickering. And over the years, I've met a number of folks who are Pickerings and Wrangles still in the programs, and I'm still in touch with some of them years, you know, into their careers. So as I say, seek out just as many folks as you can, you know, in all generations, all genders, all backgrounds, because, you know, it's a, we're going out into the world, literally, you know, all, however many countries and cultures and languages there are. So the greater diversity of input that you can get will stand you in stead in your career, and also just as you deal with, you know, a very diverse world out there that will be your home for your career. And good luck and congratulations.
Bernadette?
I don't have much more to add to what my colleagues have said, except perhaps, you know, when you, even before you get to post, of course, you're going to network, but also once you get to post, and there are people that have, you know, served at other assignments and have more experience, and you take advantage of the people at post when you first arrive. You know, they can give you some good guidance as well. So you can definitely find mentors at your future post, wherever that may be.
I wanted to throw in a couple of things because I don't think they're really gender specific. One is that there is sometimes a feeling that Pickering fellows have not come in through the competitive route, which is absolutely false. In my experience, some of the best younger officers and most prepared ones are those who have come in through the Pickering route. So don't take any stuff from anybody on that one. There's two things I just wanted to mention. Yeah, there's any number of, you know, free advice is what you paid for it, or worth what you pay for it. But as you think about where you want to go on your first post, remember that if you go to a smaller post, you will almost certainly have more responsibility than if you go to a large post, particularly because your first job is likely to be a consular job. And if you're in a post with one or two people as consular officers, you do everything. And you learn a lot. You learn a lot about management too. And some people say, oh my God, I've got to go out and do this first job as a visa officer. Well, you know, you learn a lot as a visa officer. You learn a lot about managing people and about managing yourself and about working with your local employees. Besides that, you never escape visa work in your whole diplomatic career, and you get in a lot of trouble if you do it wrong. So it's good to know it. So small posts are places where you'll have more responsibility than large posts. Now, large posts might be more fun, or have a better social life, or, you know, be in a country where you can travel more. So it's a personal balance, but it's just something to know. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because I hear a lot of questions from people thinking about going into the Foreign Service, is about work-life balance. And how am I going to handle this? And it's a tough question because you're on duty. If you're abroad, you're really on duty 24/7. And you're part of a tribe. You may think I'm an individual. I want to be regarded as an individual, but in a lot of cultures, you're going to be regarded as a member of a group. And so work-life balance often has to be averaged between posts. You can get it between posts or between tours or in jobs, but it's very difficult to get it on a day-by-day basis. If you want it on a day-by-day basis, you probably drive yourself crazy. Jovana, back to you for a question.
If I might, I got a direct question just to me that if I might answer that, because won't be able to type an answer from Ms. Ismailova, who asked about the case law for women having to leave the foreign service when they got married. The extraordinary thing is it was not written into law. It was just State Department practice. And this again is, I want to pay tribute to the women who fought and stood up, because a lot of them were just saying, no, I'm not going to resign. I mean, really fought on a personal basis. I'm thinking, you'll remember these folks, Ron, Phyllis Oakley is one I'm thinking of. There were others. So that's the incredible thing about it. There was no law that said you had to do this. It was just practice. And it was women who just were starting to say no and fought it, and that made them change the practice. So again, to women or to all people, I mean, one, honor the people who, in whatever field, who were willing to fight and stick their neck out, and be willing to be an agent of change yourself.
Great. Jovana?
Thank you, Bob, for your question, who is a former intern. With your immediate family, who inspired you to push through life's barriers?
I guess this is to each of us, or each of the panelists?
Yes, that's for each panelist.
I want to start, I mean, being of not a younger generation, a different generation than Laura, the people that she mentioned, because I started in 1990, people she mentioned to me and the anecdotes about what women faced in the Foreign Service before my time made me even more determined to be a successful diplomat. And not because I was a woman, but they had such a hard time achieving what their dreams were and their aspirations were, that I was inspired by that. And then, of course, we're inspired for so many people in different walks of life. Bernadette mentioned when you go to posts and you get to know people, some of the people that I worked with, the most inspiring were what we call our local employees, who have sacrificed so much to work with Americans and for Americans, sometimes at the risk of their own lives, their own perils. And so they, to me, we had it easy. They often had it much more difficult, and to me, they were some of the most inspirational people I've met.
If I could just chime in there on our locally employed staff, absolutely crucial part of our diplomacy. I also want to, as Kathleen did, pay tribute to some of the women who worked as locally employed folks. I mean, I think about Turkey, which was still very much a pretty patriarchal society. Some of the most committed feminists I've ever known and worked with were women in Turkey. I'm talking about the early 90s. Same thing in Turkmenistan, where it could be a real problem for you to be working for an American embassy. Incredibly committed, tough women in societies where, particularly Turkmenistan, women do not rise to the top, to put it mildly. But again, where you as a diplomat can make a lot of difference when you seek out women, when you promote aid programs that will empower women through whether it's education or small business loans or something, you can have a direct effect also on those women in other countries. And that's really quite an extraordinary thing to think about when you think about what you can do to empower women serving overseas, where we may have our complaints in the US, but comparatively we're in pretty good shape compared to so many countries around the world. So it's great if we can all do our bit to help promote gender balance around the world and equal opportunity.
I want to see if we can get in one more question here. So Jovana, you got another in chat, and then we'll let Bernadette start that one so we get equal opportunity here.
Can you share a memorable, thank you, Grace, for your question. Can you share a memorable experience or achievement in diplomatic career that you are particularly proud of?
Okay, I did touch on that a little bit earlier about girls' education when I was in Niger. At the time, as I said, most girls did not attend school. But by the time my team left, I would say the participation of girls, in fact, the participation of girls and boys increased because even though we were promoting girls' education, it was a benefit to all of the community. So just literacy generally in the country, I would say, improved. And with the help of a lot of our Peace Corps volunteers who were helping teaching teachers to teach, that also was a very productive program, I would say, for those 4 years that I was there. I don't know, as I said, subsequently how much further they have gone in some of those remote areas, but I felt very good leaving the country, knowing that girls were in a better place and that a lot of local communities across the whole of Niger were in a better place. We were also, I felt at that time, working towards maintaining the peace, because part of the travel that I did as ambassador included activities that attracted the young people, youth. We did 3 caravans around the country dealing with sports, soccer, basketball, and what we would call Greco wrestling. And the third one was hip hop music. And we always had messages for the young people and talked about education using those vehicles of sports that would attract youth. So I felt that we left with a very good message and had a great deal of impact with educating young people and families about the importance of education for the benefit of the country as a whole.
I know we're just about on closing time, but Laura and then Kathleen, you have a quick sort of what I'm proudest of or most satisfied by?
Well, I maybe cite 2 things just in general. Arms control, as I say, traditionally a field that wasn't very woman friendly. So when I started in conventional arms control in Europe, I think I was the first of any delegation I can think of, woman delegation member on the ground. So that treaty, unfortunately, the Conventional Forces Treaty is now defunct. But I think just by virtue of being on the ground, a member of the delegation, I was the note taker because I was a Russian language speaker. I think in subsequent roles have encouraged other women to think about careers in nuclear security, arms control in general. So if that's the case, I'm happy about that. I'm happy about the fact that as ambassador in Turkmenistan, I had great access to a dictator. I used the fact that I could speak publicly in Turkmen to my advantage. I talked to him about education, the importance of education, almost more than any other subject except for supporting our efforts in Afghanistan, Ron. This is during the war. And it was always, women have got to be included equally with men. So I'm not sure what success I had, but I'm proud of the fact that I pushed that every opportunity I got where it mattered with the dictator who ran everything in the country.
And just very quickly, I was an economic officer. One of their 4 cones is consular, political, management, and economic, and public diplomacy, 5 cones, I should say. And I think I was probably most pleased with the work that I did promoting U.S. business overseas and equally leveling the playing field for U.S. companies and representing American interests overseas as best as I could.
Thank you. Yes, it's a fascinating career. I was tempted to add a few more, but we're really running out of time. But first of all, I want to thank Jovana for having thought of this and getting us to put it together. I want to thank our audience. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something that you find useful in it. I think all of us have this feeling that diplomacy is an exceptionally exciting, challenging career. You know, anywhere in life you have some difficulties, but I think you would find in the Foreign Service men and women of an intellectual quality that equal or exceed that in any other profession. George Kennan said that diplomacy is an intellectual profession and a discipline as just as much as any other, and I believe he was right. He also said, by the way, that diplomacy involves serving people who don't know they need to be served, are not sure they want to be served, and don't necessarily want you to do it. So it's not a profession in which you're always thanked, but it is one that is very satisfying. Jovana, thank you for having this idea. Thank you for our audience. Jovana, any final comments from you as we wrap it up?
I would love to thank the American Academy of Diplomacy. It's a true honor and privilege to be an intern. I would love to thank Sienna, Maria, and Katie for supporting me along this process, and also to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists for their time, their willingness, and of course for their service and for serving our nation abroad.
And on that note, we render you back the rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for attending.